The growing presence of microplastics in our environment has been a cause of concern for years, but recent findings suggest that these tiny plastic particles might be entering our bodies in ways we have not yet fully understood. The latest research indicates that these particles, particularly those in the nanoplastics range, may be accumulating in our arteries, potentially increasing the risk of severe cardiovascular issues, including strokes. This discovery adds yet another alarming dimension to the already troubling issue of plastic pollution, raising questions about the long-term impacts of exposure to these ubiquitous particles that are nearly impossible to avoid. Microplastics and nanoplastics are tiny fragments of plastic that have broken down from larger plastic debris in the environment. These particles are so small that they can easily penetrate biological barriers, entering our bodies through the food we eat, the water we drink, and even the air we breathe. As researchers continue to study the various health risks associated with microplastics, a disturbing pattern is beginning to emerge, particularly in relation to cardiovascular health. Recent studies have found elevated levels of these particles in the plaques that form in the carotid arteries of people with a history of stroke or mini-strokes, a type of vascular blockage that can cause significant neurological damage. The carotid arteries, which supply blood to the brain, are particularly vulnerable to the effects of plaque buildup. When these arteries become clogged with fatty deposits, blood flow to the brain can become impaired, potentially leading to a stroke. The presence of microplastics in these plaques is a concerning finding, suggesting that these particles might play a role in the development or exacerbation of arterial blockages. In a recent study, researchers found that the concentration of microplastics in the plaques of individuals who had experienced stroke or transient ischemic attacks, mini strokes, was significantly higher than in those without such symptoms. In fact, the levels of microplastics in these plaques were found to be up to 51 times higher than in the arteries of healthy individuals. These findings raise important questions about the potential impact of microplastics on the cardiovascular system. While the exact mechanism by which microplastics contribute to vascular damage is still not fully understood, there are several possible explanations. One theory is that the accumulation of microplastics in the carotid arteries might trigger an inflammatory response, which could contribute to the development of atherosclerosis, a condition where fatty deposits build up in the arteries and cause them to narrow. This could, in turn, increase the risk of clot formation and subsequent stroke. Additionally, the presence of these particles might interfere with the function of key molecules, such as nitric oxide, which are essential for maintaining healthy blood flow and vascular function. The source of these microplastics is another alarming aspect of the issue. While many people may assume that plastic products like water bottles and packaging are the primary culprits, researchers have found that the majority of microplastics in our bodies likely come from the food and water we consume. These particles can enter the food chain when plastic waste breaks down in the environment, contaminating soil, water, and marine ecosystems. As animals ingest contaminated water or food, microplastics can accumulate in their tissues, which are then passed on to humans when we consume seafood, processed food, or contaminated drinking water. The pervasive nature of microplastics makes it nearly impossible to avoid exposure to these particles. While efforts to reduce plastic waste and prevent further contamination of the environment are crucial, they may not be enough to protect us from the existing plastic pollution already present in our ecosystems. Moreover, the fact that microplastics can accumulate in the human body over time only increases the potential risks to our health. Given the widespread presence of these particles in the environment, it is likely that most people have already been exposed to some degree, making the need for further research and preventive measures even more urgent. Despite the promising findings of the current study, it is important to note that the research is still in its early stages. The study has several limitations, including its small sample size and the difficulty in accurately measuring the amount of microplastics in biological samples. The researchers themselves caution that it is too early to draw definitive conclusions about the direct impact of microplastics on stroke risk. However, the early results are concerning enough to warrant further investigation. The researchers also point out that while the presence of microplastics in plaques may be linked to cardiovascular events, it is unclear whether these particles are the cause of the plaques or merely a symptom of another underlying health issue. Given the current lack of effective methods to avoid microplastic exposure, it is important for individuals to be aware of the potential risks associated with plastic contamination. While it is difficult to eliminate all sources of microplastics from our daily lives, there are steps that can be taken to reduce exposure. Opting for whole foods, minimizing the consumption of processed foods, and reducing the use of single-use plastics can all help to lower the amount of plastic particles that enter the body. Additionally, supporting environmental initiatives aimed at reducing plastic waste and promoting cleaner production methods is crucial for addressing the root cause of this problem. As we learn more about the effects of microplastics on human health, it will become increasingly important to find ways to minimize exposure and protect ourselves from the potential long-term consequences. The current research on microplastics and stroke risk is just the beginning, and there is still much to be learned. However, the findings thus far are troubling enough to warrant further scrutiny, particularly as we consider the increasing prevalence of plastic pollution in our environment. Until we have a clearer understanding of the full extent of the dangers posed by microplastics, it is wise to remain cautious and take proactive steps to reduce exposure whenever possible.